If death is the separation of the soul from the body, then there must be a moment in time when this happens, a scenario of before and after. One moment, a person is alive. The next, they're dead. So we have a concept of the moment of death. Developments in modern science and our abilities to assist the body in continuing to live after fairly traumatic damage suggest that there is no moment of death. It is more a process of death. This is reflected in the central argument that death is a loss of integrity. So it must be asked, what is responsible for the integration of the brain if the brain does not function? Integration is impossible, and the soul and the body part company. This integrator theory of the brain has another, even more pressing issue. How can we know if the entire brain has ceased functioning? In 2020, the World Brain Death Project published a report seeking international consensus on the minimum criteria for brain death. This report had 8 proposed criteria. 1. No evidence of arousal or awareness to maximal external stimulation. 2. Pupils fixed in mid-sized position and unreactive to light. 3. Absent corneal, oculocephalic, and oculovestibular reflexes. 4. Absent facial movement to noxious stimuli. 5. Absent gag reflex to bilateral posterior pharyngeal stimulation. 6. Absent cough reflex during deep tracheal suctioning. 7. No brain-mediated motor responses to noxious stimulation of the limbs. And 8. Lacking spontaneous respirations during apnea test targets of pH less than 7.3 and PaCO2 greater than or equal to 60 millimeters of mercury. Effectively, death is caused by cardiac arrest. The heart stops beating and the blood ceases circulating, which means that all body areas cease receiving the oxygen needed. Technically known as ischemia, this is particularly devastating for the brain and its 86 billion or so neurons. Basically, they can't store energy, so they die quickly. This is an excerpt from Anthony Peake's Near-Death Experiences, the Science, Psychology, and Anthropology Behind the Phenomenon. Every culture has its ghosts, its legends, its mysteries.
From UFOs to haunted houses, psychic visions to cryptids, we explore the stories that defy explanation and what they reveal about what it means to be human.
I'm Chris Daly.
And I'm Ryan Geckner. We're anthropologists asking big questions about belief, experience, and the unknown.
This is Beyond the Human.
All right, everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Human. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what Chris likes to call the ultimate medical mystery, death. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between biological death versus social death, what that means, all the anthropological hand-wringing between the differences, and all of that. So first, we're going to just dive into specifically what is biological death. Now, this is something that you probably think you know the answer to, more than likely. When I teach, I oftentimes ask students to think about what the most important part of the body is. And because there's lots of different cultural definitions about what is the most important part of the body. And in the United States, with my students, typically, it's a split between the brain or the heart. And that is all wrapped up in our definitions of what keeps people alive, right? And what it means to be dead. And so we're going to kind of dig into that a little bit and probably confuse you a whole lot about what actually death is.
That's the point of it,
That's
right?
the point, yeah.
I mean, if you listen to that initial excerpt there's those 8 criteria just for brain death. I mean, we never think about that.
No.
When you look at it on TV, you just see flat lines.
Right. Yes.
And that's it. That's death.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing that gets me about that quote is that those are the 8 that they came to a consensus on.
Right.
So there's probably a whole bunch more that they didn't include, which is kind of mind-boggling in a sense. But so I think the most important thing to just kind of lead with as we talk about the idea of biological death is that there is no universal definition. So you'll notice in that opening excerpt, that was from 2020, so that's recent. And we're going to walk you through some of the sort of changes in that over time. Because around the world and throughout history, people have defined death as a lot of different things, but ultimately it comes down to this idea of when a person can no longer come back. We're going to talk about how we draw that line, what happens to people afterwards, and all the different cultural ideas around that. And granted, we're not going to talk about all of that because this would be like a months long episode to talk about how
We
all the
could
cultural
we could
differences.
do an entire podcast
Yes, just on this.
on death.
Just on this. Yeah, just death in the afterlife. We could cover that forever and ever. But so we're going to give you kind of a taste of kind of some basic ways that anthropologists kind of approach understanding death and the way that people around the world approach death differently and kind of what that means for how we understand things related to the paranormal and supernatural. Because as you know, if you're participating in anomalies, which if you're not, you should be.
You should be.
We would very much encourage you to be. And if you haven't, please go listen to our mini episode about the project. So much of our ideas about the paranormal and the supernatural, particularly around ghosts and hauntings and things like that, is wrapped up in our ideas about death and what happens to you after you die, and kind of whether or not people can communicate with us afterwards.
And incidentally, that's why we ask questions about death.
Yes, that's exactly why it's in there.
On and
because, yeah, because there's so much about our beliefs around those phenomena that are wrapped up in our ideas about death. And I think as someone who has studied the paranormal and gone on ghost hunts and whatever you want to call them, I don't think we often think about that, but like it is so intrinsically wrapped up in how we think you can communicate or can't communicate with ghosts and spirits. So let's start with just kind of a very basic definition. So medicine uses kind of multiple possible definitions for death. First is this idea of the cessation of cardiopulmonary activity. That means your heart and your lungs are not working. They're not pumping the blood. They're not pumping the oxygen. They're not doing their jobs anymore. Or a cessation of natural cardiopulmonary activity. And so that means you're not connected to anything that's keeping those organs functioning and doing their jobs. But then there's also this idea of the cessation of brain activity. And so this is where we get into this kind of idea of what's more important to keep to like what is the I guess what's the source of life in the body, right? What keeps the body going? Is it the brain? Is it the heart and lungs? Is it a combination of both? Well, we're going to find out that we really aren't sure. But
spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. We really don't know. But this idea that the brain quits functioning and then in turn all of the rest of your regular bodily functions are no longer working anymore. Again, we can talk about this idea of total brain death or the cessation of higher brain activity. Parts of the brain can still be functioning, but they're not, you're not having cognitive function, things like that. And those are kind of the basic, broad umbrella definitions. But that has become very complicated as death has become more and more medicalized. The idea of life support is a relatively new invention or a new sort of thing in Western medicine. And so it wasn't always that someone could be on some sort of life support device and kept alive for a period of time. Before 1968, death was kind of defined as the cessation of all vital functions, including respiration and a heartbeat. And this is what's called the heart and lung definition. And this is probably what many people think about when they think about, how they define death. And that's
they
probably
do
because
definitely.
of television.
well, yes, definitely. And people start thinking about it a little bit differently when they start thinking about, quote, pulling the plug.
Right.
But when you talk about pulling the plug, what you're talking about doing is removing artificial heart and lung function.
Right.
So it really is still about that heart and lung function. The brain is a lot more mysterious.
Yeah.
And that's why things get a little strange there.
And so, yeah, no, that's good. So after 1968, the reason we were looking at 1968 is because Harvard Medical School, because Harvard can't keep its fingers out of anything, created this ad hoc committee to develop what's called the Harvard criteria.
There's nothing wrong with Harvard.
There's nothing wrong with Harvard. I'm just saying, Harvard's everywhere. I don't think they weren't in on the Morgellon stuff or the Lyme stuff though. So good for them on that. But in response to the development of these machines that could keep someone's heart and lungs functioning artificially, people were like, hold on a minute, we have to kind of figure out, okay, how do we define death now if we can just keep someone plugged into this machine and they could hypothetically live forever? And so this committee developed what becomes known as the Harvard criteria. This is where the idea of brain death comes into the conversation as the definition of death, where we're focusing more on cessation of brain activity rather than the heart and lungs. Because, that makes sense, right? If we have machines that can keep the heart and lungs doing their thing, and hypothetically keeping everything else going, then maybe we need to pay attention to some other part of the body. These criteria use unreceptivity, unresponsiveness, no movements or breathing after disconnecting from the ventilator for up to 3 minutes, no reflexes with further delineation of no brainstem reflexes, and a flat EEG after 24 hours with no change. This is all stuff that's talking about whether or not your brain is functioning anymore. It has nothing to do with your heart or lungs doing their job. You could still be breathing at this point, but if these things are not working, then as far as the Harvard criteria goes, you're no longer alive.
And keep in mind, this was 1968. And I bring that up because
you could still smoke in hospitals then.
Well, yes, you could. But I bring this up because today we look at things a bit differently because we've realized we've seen people come back from brain death of 24 hours. I mean, that's really not a very long period. And so,
which is wild to think about.
Right, right. I mean, in 1968, they were looking at really what I would consider a very short time frame that they were looking at to define death. And, we can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because some people would argue why it would be good to only look at a short time period. But they've changed in further years later on.
Yeah, and I think the thing that gets me too is like, in addition to 1968, in 2020, we're talking about this again. And then again in 1981, the President's Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedicine and Behavioral Research recommended that all states adopt this Uniform Determination of Death Act. So the fact that the president had to get together, get some homies together and say, hey, guys, we got to get everybody on the same page about what it means to say someone's dead. That is wild to me in 1981 that we still had to do that. And we're still talking about it now. Like I think death is something we take for granted. Right, we don't think about.
We're all going to go through it.
Well, yeah, okay. Nobody's getting out of this alive.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess you could cryo freeze yourself, and maybe
you could go like the full Walt Disney treatment or whatever. But I don't think that's outside of my tax bracket. Let's be honest. So anyway, so even up into the 80s, states didn't have this uniformity about how we determine someone's dead.
We actually still don't.
Oh, that's lovely. Love that. All of this, okay, so you'll learn from listening to us, listening to any anthropologist talk, is that everything we think is real is all made up. We all just decide that, like, this is what we mean when we say that thing. So, for example, death. Something that we all think is, hard and fast, black and white. Actually, not so much.
And people really, I mean, you just assume you know what you mean.
Yes.
When you say death, when you hear someone say a person is dead, we make an assumption that we know what that means. But if you really delve into the research, we don't.
We don't.
It's so strange. Like,
really,
you would
really
think that is one thing that we could all just come to an agreement on.
Nope.
We can't agree on anything in this world. So not even death.
Not even death.
So you mentioned the 1981 President's Commission. And so in 1981, there was a decision, okay, an individual has sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, is dead. Either or.
So even if you've got a few sections of your brain still kicking
right.
around,
So we got an either or there. It further asserts that a determination of death must be made in accordance with accepted medical standards. And this is called total brain death, once all of those things are true. That leaves some room for interpretation because you throw in this, accepted medical standards.
Yeah, I was about to ask, what is that?
Right. What does that mean? And it means different things to different people. So even when they came up with this in 1981, which actually is quite a few years ago at this point.
It's a minute ago. Yeah. Not that long ago, though.
In the greater span of medicine, no, it's not. In the greater span of death existing, it's certainly not. So move forward to present day. Definitions of death in the United States are done by the state. So every state has a different definition. Now, I'm not going to say that some aren't overlapping, some are similar, but every state has a different definition.
Now I'm like extremely curious.
And then there's also different definitions around the world. So this just makes it really, I'm going to just use the word weird.
Yeah, it does.
We have so many different definitions still to this day. So then when I started thinking about this episode, I started thinking about, well, how do we pronounce someone dead?
If we can't agree on what death is.
Right. If we don't know what death is, how do we say this person's dead? Because at some point we have to do that because then we move forward into
The process.
the process. So how do we do this? And so having worked in a clinical department at a hospital, I started thinking about, well, what does a doctor do? And so I found something really interesting. This is from Stanford Medical School. This is similar at a lot of different hospitals, but so before entering the patient's room, you talk to the covering nurse. Isn't that okay? First of all, thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. I like that.
And they make a note saying that this should be away from the patient and the family. Thank you again.
Also a good note. All right, Stanford, we're doing good.
So you're asking, in this conversation, you're asking, well, when did cardiac activity cease? When did the patient stop breathing? Is the patient an organ donor? And is an autopsy required? And I wanted to say for a second, is the patient an organ donor doesn't make you determine if they're dead or not. And I just want to say that really clearly because there's so many people out there who think if you say you're an organ donor, they're just going to let you
They
go.
just want to harvest those organs. Let's go.
This is about putting you on life support to preserve those
Make
organs.
sure they can get here in time with the igloo coolers to.
So, think about being an organ donor. Please, it's not, they're not going to kill you because you're an organ donor. Anyway. Okay, so now you enter the room after you've had this discussion. Verbally identify yourself. Thank you. Good. Verbally identify the patient. This is really important. Ensure the patient isn't hypothermic. So why do we want to do that? Why do we care if the patient's hypothermic? Well, first of all, what does hypothermic mean? It means you're cold.
Very cold.
Really cold. If you are very, very cold, like let's say you were submerged in icy water and you came out of that, you may appear dead because all of your body functions slow down when you're in that really cold temperature. And so if the patient is still hypothermic, you need to warm them up first because they might actually be alive. So you warm them up and you see if that'll sort of kickstart the heart, the lungs, etc., brain activity, whatever. Okay, so you ensure that. Then you note the general appearance of the patient and any spontaneous movement that may be occurring. Keeping in mind, spontaneous movement does not mean the person's alive. Our bodies are full of electricity and, we can have some spontaneous movement. Keeping on going. This is a long process.
It is a long process.
Much
longer than what's on TV.
Right. Oh, yeah. On TV, just, we have a flat line, time of death.
Time of death. I'm calling it.
So, okay, now you've noticed the general appearance, you've noticed any spontaneous movement. You note a lack of reaction to verbal or tactile stimulation. So you check tactile stimulation and you do a strong sternal rub, or you pinch the patient in the medial brachial area, which is immediately distal to the axilla. You really want to try to make them move. You want to check their eyes. So you shine bright light into somebody's eyes and you want to see what happens to the pupils. So you want to find no pupillary light reflex if you're trying to say someone is dead. The pupils should be fixed, dilated, so they should stare straight forward. They should be the same size and not react to the light. You want to ensure no breath or lung sounds for about a minute. You really want to wait that long because it's possible that you could have someone who's breathing very infrequently. Sometimes you can even have those last labored breaths. You talk about those last breaths that someone has. They can be like 90 seconds apart. So you really want to wait to hear that. You also want to find no heartbeat or pulse for about a minute. Then you can pronounce the patient dead and you say it out loud and you identify the time. So that they have correct on TV.
Okay, so they got the last step of 11 steps. Well, entering the room, I guess they do that too. So we got 2 of 11 steps.
So yeah, it's a long process.
It's very legalistic.
It is, and there's reasons for that. If you really want to think about it, it should be legalistic.
It should, it should be. Yeah.
Because you don't want to screw this up.
Yeah, that would be bad.
This is the diagnosis you do not want to screw up.
Well, this is why we don't have to put little bells on sticks in the cemeteries anymore. We've worked it out that we hopefully won't put you in the ground while you're still kicking. Hopefully.
So the moment when your vital organs stop working, and your vital organs obviously are what's keeping you alive. That moment is really only part of this process that we're describing. And I do this with my students. I take people through this process of dying. And, we think about this as this very short process. When it happens naturally, it's actually quite long. And so when you think about someone as they're aging, you may notice some of these things well before you're thinking of that person actually ceasing to live. Um, so there are changes that occur over time. And well, some of these you tend to sleep more and you have less physical activity. That can start way earlier. And that's not always part of the dying process. But it is true that as you get closer to death, if you look at, say, hospice patients, you see them sleeping more and more, and they're not moving around much. So I'm not talking about the standard, well, I have kids now, so I have less physical activity, or, yeah.
Because I'm getting less sleep.
That's true.
We're getting less sleep.
But you're more tired.
But I'm much more tired.
Yeah. Okay. So you more sleep, less physical activity. You tend to have a decreased appetite and thirst. And I mean, anyone can think about if you've got relatives out there who are older. I have an aunt who is 100, actually a great aunt, but she's 100 years old. And she has a very low appetite and not a lot of thirst. And it's not, that she's going to die tomorrow, I hope. But over time, you do tend to have a decreased appetite. Over time, again, will have an inability to control your bowel and bladder. They always say you start in diapers and you end in diapers. And it's true. Your body just loses certain functions. You'll start to have a breakdown of your muscles and your skin. If you've ever seen patients who are bedridden, they can have really bad ulcerations, pressure ulcers. They can be horrific. And that's why you need to keep sort of shifting a patient when they're in the bed. And that's why nursing care is really important for that. But you can have tremendous breakdown of muscles and skin and get horrible infections and things, really bad. People also go through kind of a withdrawal and detachment from others. They start to keep to themselves more. And so if you have an elderly person in your life, family, friend, neighbor, whatever, if you start to notice them being more withdrawn, reach out to them, check on them, see how everything's going. That's important. You'll start to have declining and irregular vital signs. So, your vital signs that you've had pretty strong your whole life might be a little bit different. You tend to get agitated. Over time, as you progress towards death, many times people will be more agitated. And some of that is they know that they're approaching death, and that's scary. It's,
Yeah.
You may look around your surroundings and perceive them differently. And some of that can be a little bit of dementia, but it can also just be you're perceiving things differently. You're seeing things differently than you were before. You'll start to have periods of unconsciousness, and you'll start to have changes in your breathing. So all of those are these things that happen over time, getting you ready for death. And I will say, to talk about, seeing things differently, being agitated, things like that. I've had some really good conversations with hospice nurses who, by the way, are like the saints on earth.
Yes.
Amazing people. But about people who are in that process of dying. And they talk about, and this is across the board. I mean, you hear this so much from these hospice nurses that they've seen so many people who will start communicating with somebody while they're in that dying process, particularly as the end is closer and closer. And they'll talk to people who are dead, and they'll say that these people are there for them. And I find that amazing and heartwarming to a degree, to say that, oh, maybe, and you can go down the road and say it's hallucinations, it's what people expect, whatever. You can interpret it however you want. I want to interpret it as a good thing. And so people do regularly see people and communicate with them. And they'll talk about seeing someone who maybe they didn't even meet. And they'll mention it to someone. They'll be like, well, that's your great grandfather, whatever. So people do have that change, and they start to perceive things that aren't there to others. And I can say that I have been around people in that state, and I've seen them watching things that I can't see. And I can't say there's nothing there. I can just say that I can't see it. And
Hmm.
I've seen them communicating with something that I can't see and can't communicate with. And that to me is fascinating, sad, scary, all of that, but it's also a really fascinating thing. And I'd love to do more research in that area. But anyway, um, so what happens during death? You wanna
Yeah, so okay, so now that we've like thoroughly confused you and now you're like, well, I don't know. I mean, I'll ultimately walk away from this episode knowing that death is a process that is almost, if not more, culturally mediated than it is biologically mediated. There's a lot of culturally based decisions that are being made that like determine like why we are saying these certain things happen, like the benchmarks that we're using, right? Come
because
out
the
of a
same things are
context.
happening biologically,
Yes,
culturally, but
yeah,
we're all interpreting these things
yes,
really differently.
right. And so if we were to think about, what is happening to someone during death, essentially the body's vital functions are just stopping entirely. So the things that you're familiar with that you're thinking of when you think about, okay, well, how do we determine someone's dead or not? As the heart stops beating, breathing in, so the brain stops functioning. So those are kind of the big three. Those are probably the things that most of our listeners were, thinking about in their heads when we started talking about how we determine someone being dead. But there are some studies that suggest that brain activity may continue even up to several minutes after a person has been declared dead, which is to me pretty wild, because I mean you think about the way that the body works, the necessity of blood and oxygen to be moving through the body so that everything's functioning and doing what it's supposed to do, but your brain is still kicking for a few minutes. And
And that makes me, and again, I have certain perspectives on this because of people in my life who have passed away. If you keep talking to that person after they pass, and many
right,
people do,
right,
there's a good shot they hear you.
right,
And that to me is amazing.
yeah, that's
And
cool.
I get really annoyed when someone tells you, well, they're dead, stop talking.
Right,
No,
right,
no, keep talking because you don't know what they might
right,
hear. And wouldn't it be cool if the last thing they heard was something really positive from
right,
you?
right. To then the sort of signs of death that sort of follow that are things like no pulse, no breath. Again, like some of these things we get listed in these other methods of determination: reflexes that don't respond to testing, pupils that don't widen in response to bright light. And so, that's kind of the what's happening there right at the end, really. Like that's kind of the end of that long drawn out process, right? Those are essentially, if we were to boil down what everybody's looking for, that's it, really. In terms of what physicians are looking for to determine whether or not someone has passed. Chris, you always ask students, or you always kind of talk about, this question of, does dying hurt?
That's because people ask it.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is. It's
because,
a big question, right?
does it
Yeah, because
hurt?
that sounds painful. Like none of that sounds like a good time,
It
really.
doesn't sound pleasant,
Right.
though it depends on how death happened. So does dying hurt? That
Right.
really depends on what's going on with the person, what causes them to die. And the first thing I'll say is something that often confuses people, but if you die suddenly, you're actually less likely to feel pain. So people who die those horrible, horrible, traumatic deaths, car accident, whatever, often they die instantaneously and they don't feel pain then. And that
Mhm.
if there can be any comfort in that
Right.
experience,
Yeah.
there's that. And
Hmm.
I'm not saying that's good comfort, but it is true that you're very unlikely to actually have experienced pain at that point. Um, so as the body goes through this process, does it have pain? Well, if you're losing a lot of blood, your body starts to direct your blood to your vital organs.
Which is kind of an amazing thing.
It really is.
Like your body just like I'm going to prioritize.
So your body starts fighting to survive as it's doing that. So that's if you're dealing with blood loss. This is just
Right.
one way of dying. So just to preface that. That does keep your organs alive, but the parts of the body that are deprived of blood are going to start to hurt.
Mhm.
So if you're dying from blood loss, your extremities may hurt. So that's
Right.
one way. Another way we talk about is someone suffering a long illness.
Yeah.
The illness is going to cause that person to have pain of a variety of different kinds, depending on what that illness is. So that's where the pain comes in. It doesn't seem that it's the actual short-term dying
Hmm.
process
Hmm.
where you're seeing the pain unless you have that sort of immediate blood
Sure.
loss. The regular dying process doesn't necessarily entail pain. So someone who's dying a natural death, and that, by the way, that is a thing. Um, people try to argue that things can't be natural, but death is natural. Sorry. But if you're dealing with an illness, that's where things come in. So cancer, as an example, can cause a variety of different pain depending on where the cancer is. So a lot of these different things will cause pain. And I personally am a big proponent of helping people with that pain, particularly
Yeah.
if you know they're going through the dying process over 6 months, 8 months, whatever it is. Help them. I mean,
Hmm.
help with that pain because we have ways to do that. But the actual dying process, probably not. It's the illness
Hmm.
process that has
Hmm.
that. So what happens after you die? And this is an interesting piece. And so I'm going to talk briefly about what happens physically
Hmm.
to the body.
Hmm.
Because then there's this idea of social death, and that is a very different thing. And it actually starts prior to death itself.
Hmm.
It's through the dying process as well. Anyway, so what happens to your body after death? Well, your muscles relax. Muscles loosen immediately after death, and so that releases the bowel and bladder. So yes, that's real.
Hmm.
Your skin may sag, makes it easier to see the bone structure underneath it. Your temperature will drop because chances are you're not in a really hot environment.
Hmm.
So your body temperature gradually decreases. It's about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. And ultimately it will match the surrounding area. Um, so that's one of the ways that they can determine time of death. If
Working
it's a if
backwards.
it's a near proximity,
Yeah, sure.
you know. So that's not like 3, 4 days.
Right,
That's,
of course.
if it's
Yeah.
if it's a near proximity, that's one thing they can use. So the blood that's in your body is pulled towards gravity. So depending on the position, you will see sort of these purplish red bruising looking splotches on the skin where it pools. And this actually happens pretty quickly because the blood has stopped moving and
Yeah,
it
that
pools
makes
pretty
sense.
quickly. Then the body will stiffen. So for initially you have this relaxation of the muscles, then the body stiffens. First at the face and neck, and then it progresses to the trunk, and then gradually it radiates out to the extremities. And that's the rigor mortis. That's another way that they can tell sort of how long it's been since a person died because you'll see that the body stiffening. Once you fast forward a few days after death, that's when the body's tissue will start to break down. And that causes the stiff parts to relax again. So, this is one of the ways that they can tell how long someone's been dead. This all changes, though, depending on the temperature in which the body is kept. And that's why
Mm.
you have these freezer drawers that you always see in the movies and on TV.
Hmm.
And those are real, but there's a purpose for them, not just to be creepy. um,
Yeah.
you put the body in there and keep the temperature cold so that you don't have tissue breaking down too quickly. So that's physically
Hmm.
what's happening to the body. Now, the soul is a different thing, and we'll get there
Hmm. Hmm.
if you believe in a soul.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but we also have something called social death.
So social death is kind of the foil, not really the foil, but kind of the sort of partner of biological death in a way, right? And this is kind of where we see some of the sort of strongest influences of cultural belief on and around death. And just like biological death is in itself a process, social death, or this idea of someone becoming the way that society recognizes someone as having passed, is also a process that starts well before someone actually passes away. There's a whole portion of this that includes, the sort of preparations for biological death, and so we can think about a lot of examples of these so for like some Western examples, like someone ordering a headstone, buying a plot to be buried in, or having these ideas about what you want to happen after you pass are all part of this idea of social death, right?
I mean, they've written up full plans,
Yeah.
And you can also bring in the idea of, have you decided you're going to be an organ donor?
Right.
Have you decided if you want to be kept alive artificially? So living wills, things like that. That's all part of social death.
Yep. And so we have some of those examples, but also like there's some really sort of structured examples. So in Catholicism, just to give us one example, here is this idea of last
Catholics are
rites.
very structured.
So structured, the most structured. Catholics love structure. Well, the church loves structure. Whether or not Catholics actually love structure is a whole other conversation. But among the seven sacraments in Catholicism is this idea of last rites or anointing of the sick. The name has changed a lot. I think it was a different name before Vatican II. It's now
anointing of the sick can be done
whenever,
right?
Yeah. And so this is the idea that it is the last sacrament that someone gets in their life, generally, usually. And it's the idea that you're preparing this person for death. So a priest comes in and they've got specific prayers that they say. And I was looking a little bit into the rules of this, and this has to be performed while someone is still alive, which I did not realize before I was sitting down and thinking about this episode. And I think, in the United States and in the West broadly, but the US is pretty bad about this. We're not good at dealing with death, really, at all in general. We're really bad about it. And I think some of it comes from this history of the medicalization of death, right? So this idea that it used to be like you would go to the hospital and that's where you died.
But before that, you did.
Before that, you died at home.
It was very natural.
Yeah.
And you died at home.
Right.
And then we decided to medicalize everything, literally from birth to death.
Yes.
We've medicalized it all.
Yes.
And you had a lot of doctors during that time period when it was very medicalized who sort of couldn't accept that their patients were going to die. And this is a rough one for me because guess what? They're going to.
You're a doctor, everyone does.
Right.
When did you miss that day in medical school?
So, like, your patients are going to die, and maybe you should be thinking about giving them a good death.
Right.
And that's where hospice comes in. But, the idea behind this medicalization, many doctors fought death, even if they knew it was inevitable with the condition that the person had. So, when you have someone in end stage COPD or very, very late stage cancer, you know that these things lead to death. But yet you still had doctors constantly fighting it and prolonging life and not prolonging good life.
Right. So I think that's the important piece, right? Is like dying in a hospital, through like being kept alive in a hospital when your health is clearly declining and you're not comfortable.
Right.
I think that's I think a lot about like how uncomfortable being in a hospital is in general, right? Like, and the times I've been in a hospital have been few and far between, and twice for the birth of my children. And like, those are good times to be at the hospital, right?
I can tell you being in a hospital long-term is awful.
Yeah. And just like, it sucks. Like no one likes going to the hospital, right?
And there are wonderful people there.
Oh, for sure. 100%. Yeah. Don't get me wrong.
But no matter what, it sucks.
Yes. Yeah. It's not a good time. Like no one's going to the hospital generally, unless somebody had a baby. You're not going to the hospital for, something good. And that's, I think, what it means for that to be the last place you are alive, I think is kind of it's hard for me to wrap my head around, I guess. Yeah.
And so there has been a move back towards people wanting to die at home. Now, sometimes it's impossible, I know that, but there are some really great hospice facilities out there where you can be in a somewhat medical environment, but also a somewhat home environment. And I think that's awesome because sometimes it's really impossible to bring someone back home.
Right.
But many people are moving back to dying at home with family surrounding them. And that's through the whole hospice care movement and palliative care. And really, I say kudos to the people who do that. Yeah, that's it's so important, so rough, but really something we should all be thinking about for the people we care about.
Right.
Yeah. Do you want someone who you love to die in a hospital, or do you want them to die at home? And it's a choice, obviously, but I think more and more people are choosing to move back home.
Yeah. Yeah. So those are kind of the preparations for death from a social perspective, right? And there's a lot more that we could get into with that. And there's a lot more that could be gotten into with all of the rest of this episode, to be honest. Like we could, like we were saying before, could do a whole podcast on what we're about to talk about for the rest of this episode. So once someone passes, then most cultures have some sort of funeral procedure. And essentially, however that looks in any given culture, it's kind of a rite of passage in a way, both for the deceased and for the people in their life. And if you're not familiar with the term rite of passage, this is an anthropological concept about how people transition from one period of their life to another.
Oh, Van Gennep.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Victor Turner and this liminality and all of that. We could get into that and go like really on a deep theoretical or a theoretical deep dive, but we don't necessarily need to here. All you need to know is that funerals really, at their core, function as this transitionary space where someone is transitioning out of their life in this world into their life in the next world, and their family members and loved ones that are left behind are transitioning from having them in their lives to not. After that, or even as part of that, we have all of these complex ideas about mourning rituals and how people grieve, and how people experience this loss. And so we have both really informal activities that like everyone probably kind of knows about or is aware of, that, some people may like the idea of wearing black, after death, is a cultural idea to show that people are in mourning. Some people cut their hair when someone in their family passes, but also certain people may avoid different kinds of social gatherings. And we can also think about the ways that that you might treat someone who has recently lost a loved one. And that's not really any sort of like formalized way to do that, but you can think about just the way that you relate to someone in that way.
And often it's really awkward.
It is super awkward because we don't deal with death very like we just don't.
And that's the thing, we really don't. And just if I can give you some advice, if you're around someone who has lost someone close to them, talk to them.
Yeah, we really avoid people.
We avoid people.
Yeah.
And you know what? This is a time where they need people.
Yeah.
They might not need someone to take them out and
right. I'm not trying to like go get lit. Like,
yeah, like you don't need to go parties.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
But just reach out and say, hey, if
you
you need someone, I'm here.
Yeah.
How are you doing? Don't say I'm sorry. It's not your fault.
It's just like a
really frustrating.
It's a weird thing to apologize for.
You
Unless you did it, in which case, like, go turn yourself in.
right. But very seriously, this is a time when people need someone, and yet in the Western world, we really are bad at this.
Yeah, we don't, particularly in the United States. We're really not good about this in the US and parts of Europe too. Where we don't really have these like nicely structured formal ways of dealing with death and like that immediate aftermath of someone passing and like moving through that period. And so we can look at like other cultural examples from other parts of the world, including some that are from the United States.
Well, I was going to say the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, Jewish tradition. Can have some of these have a lot more formal, structured ways of mourning that are built to avoid things like that. Like, for example, sitting Shiva in the Jewish tradition is this like week period of mourning after someone passes where the family members don't leave their home and everyone comes to them. And it's a big tradition of bringing food to the family and all of that. And so it's this period of people coming to you to support you. And it's like, that's the whole point of the thing.
Yeah.
And
it happens informally for a lot of people. But I love the formality of it because
it's there's
like do.
Well, and I think for me it goes beyond this idea of like what to do. That is nice, right? Like you just have directions. Like, all right, all right. Well, someone passed, so I got to go make a lasagna or whatever it is, But no, I think what I like about it is that it's like there's this sense of obligation with it, right? And like I think obligation is another like nicer way to say guilt. But I think like
you're not Catholic.
I'm not.
We own guilt.
You own guilt. That's fine. But I think like there's this sense with like traditions like Shiva where that someone's going to do it for you at some point. And so you return that favor for them. And I think like that sort of reciprocal relationship, and we could get in a whole nother like theoretical deep dive on gift giving and how that all works. But I think that like reciprocality there is like really cool. Like I think that's the coolest part of these. It has less to do with the fact that it's like structured and that you have a to-do list, but it's, that there is this sense of, okay, this is what I'm supposed to go do now. And so you have sitting Shiva, you have in Buddhism, they have this really nice 49-day period after the death that is specifically demarcated as this space where the deceased soul is transitioning from their previous life to their next life. And there's a lot of sort of theology around what's happening with the soul then. But this is an important period for the family members as it's marked as this place where, this is where you're mourning. And after that period, there are certain things that, you're supposed to do to help that person's soul or spirit transition on to their next life. We have examples of these around the world. I mean, even like a Lakota example, this idea of ghost keeping, which is essentially where the person's spirit is housed with you and fed until the anniversary of their death. And this is to sort of mark their journey onto the afterlife as well. And I think what's really interesting about this is that like we do a lot of hand wringing in the United States about like the afterlife and like what it means and what happens to you after you die. But we have no real good structures around like doing these things. And in each of these traditions, particularly in the Lakota and Buddhist context, is the circumstances of one's mourning or the mourning that your family members do for you have influences on your experience of the afterlife. And I think it's probably like a read on like Western individualism or something. Like that's probably what I'm getting at here without really getting at it, is that like there's this sense of community. There's like this communal sense of, when someone passes, like it's all of our job to like make sure they have a good afterlife. And that I think is really cool. Like we should do that. We
And
should get
it
better.
serves not just the person who has passed on or just that immediate family, it serves kind of everyone connected to them.
Yeah.
To have these kinds of rituals and things
And
available.
I think too, and this is just like me spitballing on the moment in the moment, is like it gives people a sense of agency over something that they don't have agency over.
Yeah.
Like it gives you a little bit of power
Yeah.
in that moment where like you've lost someone and
because you
can't
have
do
no
anything.
power when you lose someone.
Right.
I mean, that's
no
it.
power. And so, these practices really give people a nice way of not only mourning, but, sort of having control over an uncontrollable situation. And so this is all kind of about the idea of how we handle grief. And Chris, you wanted to really dial in on
Yeah, I just want, I
grief.
think if we're talking about death and dying, and we're talking about hospice, and we're talking about grief, you have to mention Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I know some people are like, oh, those 5 stages of death, they're not they're not linear. You know what? They were never meant to be linear stages. So I just want to mention what
They're a
they
check-all
are.
that apply, not step by step.
It's not a step by step, but it's important to recognize. And you know what? You go back and forth among them. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with, and this was 50 years ago, um, the idea that there are these stages you go through the grieving process. And I would argue it's not just for death. It's for other things as well, whenever you lose something. And I would also argue that it starts before the person dies.
Yeah. Yeah.
It often starts when you learn that the person is dying.
In the process.
In the process. So there's denial. And, everybody, I think, experiences that at some point. Like, no way. No, that person's not gone. What do you mean that person's gone? And that can be particularly prevalent if someone died suddenly. Then there's anger. And, I have to say, many people get stuck right there.
Yeah.
I'm mad. And you know what? Don't feel bad about it.
Right.
It's okay to be that angry. And it's okay if you have trouble getting out of that anger. That can be one of the toughest things to get past. And that's why I say this is not linear, because the anger comes back. You could have lost someone 10 years ago and something happens and it triggers you to feel that anger again. So you can move in different directions in these stages of grief. And so maybe the term stages is what really shouldn't be what we talk about. Maybe it should be something else. I don't know what the right word is. But so you have denial, you have anger, you have bargaining. And often that bargaining is like with a deity. Right. You're like, and sometimes this definitely happens before the person dies, like take me instead, or, if you do this or and so there's this kind of bargaining that goes on. Then there's, of course, depression. And that can last, oh, a lifetime.
Hmm.
And sometimes does. I mean, that sometimes, depression is just always, always present. And then the final one is acceptance or integration. This is the one that you sort of strive towards. And I want to make it clear that you're never going to go back to a normal life. When someone close to you dies, you don't go back to a normal life. It just doesn't happen. So when you talk about acceptance, you're not saying that person, oh, just accept this, move on, and go back to the way you were. That's never going to happen. And don't ask for that to happen. You have to integrate this new aspect of your life that this person is gone, whoever it may be. You integrate it into your life and you create what I always call a new normal. You suddenly have something new as your baseline,
Hmm.
just your normal. And you know what? There might be some depression in there that doesn't go away. There might even be some anger in there that doesn't go away. There's things like that. Um, but this is all important because as we talk about the different things that people do when someone dies, it's dealing with some of these
Hmm.
stages of
Yeah.
grief.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have 49 days to deal with certain things, that can help you through
Hmm.
some of this and it can help you move towards that integration state where and because I don't like the word accepted because it's
Yeah.
kind of a tough word.
Yeah.
Like, if someone close to you dies, it's hard to accept. But
Yeah.
you can move forward and hit a point where you have this new normal available to you. And a lot of the things that are available to you in different cultures help you through that process. And that's why I thought we needed
Hmm.
to kind of
Yeah, no,
kind of
that's
just talk
good.
about
Yeah,
grief a
no,
little
I
bit.
think not to be maybe cold, but like having a hard deadline is actually kind of nice. Like if you go, oh, I got 49 days to deal with this. All right, well, let's buckle in. So that's all kind of this sort of transitionary period of, someone passing and then kind of how the family members or, people in their life are dealing with it. So then what happens after death? We've done a lot of talking for the last however long about, death itself and getting to that point and what it means to die and how we determine, when that actually happens. But what happens afterwards? And if we look cross-culturally, there are actually quite a few cultural universals surrounding the afterlife and the beliefs around what, that looks like or can be. And so one of the big ones that I think many people will be really familiar with maybe is this sense of a transition or a journey. And so one of the ways that we can see this is the sort of thresholds that spirits have to cross. So a lot of times you'll hear about rivers or bridges or gates. So to like give you some simple examples that you might be familiar with, in the ancient Greek tradition, the idea of the river Styx separating our world from the underworld. This is the river that spirits have to travel on to get to the underworld. Catholics, again, with their like excellent structure, have the idea of purgatory, which I think a lot of people don't actually understand what purgatory is.
Yeah.
It's this place where souls go after death to be purified before going to heaven. And there's a lot of like reasons for why that is, and I'm not going to get
That's a
into
whole
those. Yeah,
podcast.
that's a whole podcast in and of itself. But it's an actual the idea is that there's an actual location, like it is a place in this journey to the afterlife. And we
And
can
there's
also
actually some
talk,
really interesting theological literature
yes,
arguing that this is
that
purgatory.
this is purgatory, and we're all here already. So yeah, which means we're all dead. So that's a whole nother discussion for another day. But we can also look at like the general sort of I don't want to say non-denominational, but it kind of is. The sort of non-denominational Christian belief in this idea of the pearly gates. The gates of heaven are sort of seen as this transition or sort of threshold that spirits have to cross before they get to heaven. We can also, to throw it back again for another, sort of ancient example in ancient Egypt. There is this idea of the gates of Duat. And the gates of Duat are the last gates that a spirit passes through, and the deceased have to know all of the names of the gates and the names of the associated spirits before they get to the gates of Duat. to pass through the afterlife. And so that's why you'll see a lot of times in tombs in Egypt, there are paintings depicting on the walls depicting this structure of the afterlife. And it's meant to be a map. It's like you wake up, you don't wake up, but you're in your sarcophagus. Your soul wakes up and you're like, "Ah, oh, sweet, somebody like map quested the whole afterlife for me." And so then you just, follow that and you know all the names of the spirits, the gates, and then you're able to get through. But also, another sort of Buddhist example, this is specifically from Mahayana Buddhism or Pure Land Buddhism, which is most popular in Southeast Asia and parts of Japan and Korea. There is this idea that once an individual's heart turns toward Amida Buddha, which is a specific bodhisattva, which I'm not even going to get into all of the details there. If you want to get into that, go check out my other podcast. We have a whole episode on Buddhism. It's called Religiously Literate. Check it out. And where we dig into like what a bodhisattva is. But basically, it's someone who's attained enlightenment but comes back to this life basically to help shepherd people on or toward enlightenment. So kind of like Jesus, and Christian missionaries latched right onto that. But there is this idea. So Amida Buddha is the most important bodhisattva in Pure Land Buddhism, and the idea is that you will never actually attain enlightenment in this life. And so when you pass, you go to the Pure Land where you have no distractions, no nothing. You can just sit and meditate and reach enlightenment in that existence, which is actually like kind of legit, and takes like so much pressure off of this existence, unless we're in purgatory, in which case I don't know. But this, interestingly, in Pure Land Buddhism, there's this idea that your heart turns toward Amida Buddha, and that itself represents that transition in your life. And so that can happen actually at any point. That doesn't necessarily have to happen, immediately before death, or immediately, like it can happen at a point much earlier in your life. And speaking about Mahayana Buddhism, just for a quick second, is they have really interesting practices around palliative care. And so they have like a whole structure around how to transition someone from what we would consider hospice care into the next life. And it's all structured around like looking at images of the Buddha and things like that, which is also a whole nother podcast in and of itself. And each of these are all kind of associated, each of these thresholds are associated with some sort of spirit typically. And so we can see Charon in the Greek ferrying the souls to the underworld. We see Saint Peter with his keys at the gates of heaven, or even Osiris at the gates of Duat, shepherding spirits onto the ancient Egyptian afterlife. So after this transition, there is this pretty general commonality of this idea of life review or judgment. And so if you grew up in, the US in a Christian environment, you're probably very familiar with this. But we can look at this idea of, judgment before entry into heaven, which is common in Christianity and Islam. Interestingly enough, not the same in Judaism, which is interesting given that they're all three Abrahamic traditions. In ancient Egypt, to go back to our example, once a spirit reaches that gate of Duat, their heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which is this other spirit being, and that determines where the soul ends up. And so the idea is that your heart should weigh less than the feather, and that's determined based on your actions throughout your life.
Okay, so this just makes me start thinking of cardiomegaly. And so if you have chronic heart failure, your heart gets bigger.
You're going to have problems if you're trying to get into the ancient Egyptian afterlife.
You're going to have some problems.
You're going to have some issues. But yeah, so like that is kind of this sense of this clear example of judgment. And interestingly, and to tease a future episode, near-death experience, folks who experience a near-death experience, that's easy to say, often talk about seeing their entire lives play out in this moment. And so this is kind of gets to that life review.
And this is cross-cultural.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at NDEs across the world, you see this. There's actually quite a few commonalities, and this is one area that I'm super interested in. So we are going to do a whole episode on that.
Yes.
And if you've had an NDE, join Anomalies, and
Anomalies.
Because we're going to ask to do an interview with you.
Yes.
And we would love to hear your story. But yes, that people who experience NDEs do often talk about that life review. Um, and they talk about it in different ways. A lot of times they talk about things as totally non-judgmental.
Yeah.
Other times you'll hear them saying they experience this feeling what the other people in their lives felt,
Hmm.
which is really just fascinating
Yeah.
and kind of scary.
Totally.
If you think about learning how other people felt about the terrible things, because we've all done terrible things, right?
Right.
Like thinking about how other people felt. Yeah. But a lot of the things that people talk about with NDEs really go along with some of these cultural universals
Hmm.
in the afterlife,
Hmm.
which is fascinating.
It is. It's wild. So after this idea of life review or judgment, there's this sense of moral reciprocity in a lot of afterlife traditions. And so lots of them, you'll see that there is this idea that the conditions of your afterlife experience reflect your earthly conduct, right? And so this is kind of that colloquial idea of karma, which karma actually does fit into this category. But, so this idea, we see this in a couple different ways cross-culturally. So we see like these ideas of dichotomies. So this idea of heaven versus hell. That's a perfect example here. If you're good in this life, you go to heaven. If you're not, you go to hell, maybe. But also, I'm just going to harp on this ancient Egyptian example because they're really good. That's really good for this. So if you pass, if your heart is lighter than the feather of Mott, then you get to go to what's called the field of reeds, which is essentially the good afterlife. And if it's not, and this is like the most metal death thing ever, I think, your entire soul gets destroyed. So you just like cease to exist altogether, which is pretty gnarly. And so we have these dichotomies, but we also have this sense of in traditions that have ideas about reincarnation or karmic rebirth, this idea that you will be reborn into something into a existence after this life based on your experiences or your actions in this life. And that's what that period of 49 days is really about. It's that transition from passing to being reborn into your next rebirth. And there's like important rituals that are done on that 49th day that are supposed to help you transition and help you get a good rebirth in the next life. And we in the United States, we kind of don't really deal well with we don't really deal well with death, which I've said like 6 times now. But
That should be the title of the
so
episode.
we don't handle death. Everybody else in the rest of the world, good job, guys. You're killing it. In the rest of the world, there is a really common practice of having continued relationships with the living. So in the anthropological literature, we typically call this ancestor veneration. And so that is essentially these ritual practices of honoring or interacting with the deceased, kind of broadly understood. And this can take a lot of forms. And in some of these, I know I dog on the way that American culture is kind of lame sometimes. Some of these we do in the US, but none of them I think are as widespread as they are in lots of other parts of the world. For example, in parts of Africa, there's this idea of the living dead, which is not really the zombies that's another living dead. But there's this idea that your ancestors, your ancestral spirits are, actively involved in your life until nobody who is alive remembers them. And then they transition into this other level of spirit, and then they have a different level of influence on your life. And that's a pretty common way of understanding the afterlife in many traditional African contexts. But we have some things in the US, or in the Americas in general, this idea of Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, which coincides with All Souls Day. See, the Catholics, you guys are doing really well this episode.
We have All Saints Day and All
And All
Souls
Souls
Day.
Day, we like
And
everybody.
saints
And you have
need to
saints who,
continue.
in some
Yeah.
sense, are kind of regarded as ancestors.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah. Like
absolutely.
totally
Yeah.
dealt with in the same ways.
Yeah.
We have some of these examples of sort of tangible practices. We also have lots of festivals if you look around the world. So in Japanese Buddhism, there's this Obon festival, and it's associated with a period of time when the ancestors are, most involved. There's this idea of filial piety in Confucianism in China, which actually, interestingly enough, led to some of the policies about only having sons when there were, when they had the one-child rule in China. A lot of daughters who were born were given up for adoption, and this is because of beliefs around filial piety. So the firstborn son is supposed to basically maintain the altar and take care of all the family's ancestors and stuff. And if you don't have a son to do that,
You've got a problem.
then you've got a problem, right? And so you can see like some of these big cultural issues that come out of some of these beliefs too. And then, just to give us another example, the Egungun Festival, which is our Yoruba festival, which involves mass dancers who are believed to be ancestral spirits embodied, that happens annually in Yoruba communities. And so, all that's to say that, we think about death as kind of I think it's really easy to think about death as a sudden, instantaneous thing. But whether
And
you're
simple.
looking and simple,
And
yeah, and
simple. We
simple,
think of it as very simple because everybody dies.
right, which is true. But all of this, whether we're thinking about biological death or social death, it's anything but instantaneous and simple.
Right.
All of these examples, whether it's the hand wringing about whether or not it's brain death or heart death or whatever, or, all of the stuff that happens after someone dies or preparing for them to pass, it's very involved for the individual, their soul or spirit, or however you want to think about that, and all the people around them.
And this is why I think of it as the ultimate mystery or the ultimate medical mystery, because I still think, is there alien life out there? That might be one of those ultimate mysteries too.
That's true.
But
we can have more than one.
Yeah. When I think about the ultimate medical mystery, the only reason we have so many different options for how to deal with something is because it's a mystery.
Right.
I mean, if we know exactly what happens, then we're not going to have all of these different beliefs about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when you have mysteries, you create beliefs around them. And if you think about all of the rituals around the world, all of the beliefs about what happens at death, after death, do ghosts exist? I mean, all of that wraps into death and what is it? And so that's why I think about it as the ultimate medical mystery. And, we can spend time defining when exactly you can say the human body is dead, but there's much more to it. And so medicine in all of its reductionism,
yes. Materialist reductionism
brings it down to that moment, but there's so much more to it. And to go back to our last episode, we talked about the culture of ghost hunting. Well, why does that even exist?
Right.
Because people are wondering what's going on after death.
And I mean the roots of paranormal investigation are in the spiritualist movement at the turn of the 20th century, and that rose to prominence in the United States in particular in the wake of the Civil War, because so many people were dead. So many mothers and daughters and wives lost men in their families in the war.
And they were trying to figure out how to deal with this, how to move forward in life with that going on. And so it comes back to us every time there are mass casualties. And, we see this resurgence in people thinking about what this means. But I think we need to talk about it more regularly and not just when there are mass casualties. People go through this every day. And maybe if we talked about it more and thought about it more out in the open, many people think about it personally, but talk about it and think about it in the open, maybe we would be able to understand it better and come to terms with it better and have less horrid outcomes from the process. So.
All right. Well, what do we got coming up, Chris?
Well, next month is December.
It is December.
So aside from the holiday season, it is the time of Mothman.
It is.
So we thought we would do a little bit of a deep dive into Mothman and what it is, he is, she is. I don't know.
I go with it.
It.
What? That'll be our first foray into cryptids. So
yes, it will.
It'll be fun.
We'll talk about kind of the story behind it and go from there.
Right on. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Human, where the strange, the supernatural, and the deeply human collide. If today's journey into the unknown sparked your curiosity, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with fellow seekers of the extraordinary.
Have a story, question, or theory of your own? Reach out. We want to hear how the paranormal shapes your world, too. You can find us online at Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep thinking beyond the human.